In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich burned and the world held its breath, a train disappeared into the mountains of southern Poland. Not just any train. A convoy loaded with gold bars stacked like coffins, art stolen from 1,000 homes, jewels that once adorned the necks of the condemned. It slipped into a tunnel carved deep beneath the earth. And then, silence. No one saw it emerge. No records documented its arrival. For 80 years it has remained somewhere in the darkness, waiting, or perhaps watching. This is the story of the Nazi gold train, a legend born in the dying gasps of history's darkest chapter. A mystery that has consumed treasure hunters, destroyed lives, and revealed something unsettling about the human soul. Because the question isn't just whether the train exists. The question is, what would you do to find it? Tonight we descend into the tunnels, we follow the whispers, and we ask the question that no one wants to answer. Is the gold still down there? Or is something else waiting in those forgotten depths? This is the legend that refuses to die. This is the train that vanished without a trace. To understand the gold train, you must first understand the end of the world. Picture Germany in the winter of 1945. The Eastern Front has collapsed. Soviet tanks are rolling across the frozen plains like a tide of iron and vengeance. Cities that stood for 1,000 years burn in a single night. The roads are choked with refugees, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that everything they knew is coming to an end. The Nazi regime, that monstrous machinery of death and ideology, is collapsing in on itself. Officers burn documents by the truckload. Soldiers abandon their posts. And in the chaos, in those final desperate weeks, something begins to move through the shadows. Convoys of trucks, trains laden with cargo too valuable to name, disappearing into the mountains and forests of the shrinking Reich. Because the Nazis had accumulated something beyond weapons, beyond territory. They had accumulated wealth, stolen wealth, the plundered treasures of an entire continent. Every conquered city had been stripped bare, museums emptied, banks raided, private collections seized. Jewish families, before they were murdered, had their possessions cataloged and confiscated with bureaucratic precision. Gold fillings pulled from teeth, wedding rings pried from fingers, paintings cut from their frames, silverware melted down, everything of value absorbed into the Reich's insatiable hunger. And now, as the Reich died, that wealth had to go somewhere. The official story says most of it was recovered, found in salt mines and bank vaults, returned to museums and archives. But those who were there, who saw the trains moving in the night, who heard the rumors whispered in bombed-out railway stations, they knew differently. They knew that something had been hidden, something the Reich wanted to keep secret, even from itself. Enter Lower Silesia, a region of southwestern Poland, then under German control. A land of dense forests, winding rivers and mountains riddled with tunnels. During the war, the Nazis had turned this region into a subterranean fortress. Project Reese, they called it, the Giant. A network of underground complexes carved into the mountains, their purpose known only to a handful of high-ranking officers. Some say the tunnels were meant to house weapons factories, safe from Allied bombers. Others whisper about secret laboratories, dark experiments too terrible to conduct in the light of day. But everyone agrees on one thing. The tunnels were vast, interconnected, and perfect for hiding something you never wanted found. And in those final weeks, as the Red Army closed in, witnesses reported seeing trains entering those mountain tunnels. Trains with their windows painted black. Trains guarded by SS officers who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Trains that carried the weight of an empire's sins. One train in particular caught the attention of those who survived to tell the tale. A locomotive that arrived in the dead of night, sometime in April 1945, near the town of Wałbrzych. The locals who saw it described hearing the wheels screech as it descended into a tunnel carved into the mountain. They described the guards who kept everyone at a distance, rifles at the ready, their faces masks of exhaustion and fear. And then they described something else. The sound of explosions echoing from inside the mountain, the rumble of collapsing earth, the sight of German soldiers emerging from the tunnel, dust-covered and silent, before they melted away into the forest like ghosts. When the war ended days later and Soviet forces swept through the region, they searched for the tunnel entrance. But the mountainside had been sealed. Rocks and earth had been brought down, erasing the entrance as if it had never existed. The train, whatever it carried, was entombed. Or was it? Because here's where the story fractures into legend. Here's where history becomes myth. Some survivors claimed the tunnel was a dead end, a tomb deliberately created to keep the Reich's treasures from falling into enemy hands. Others insisted the tunnel was part of a larger network, that the train could have traveled underground for miles before emerging somewhere else, somewhere hidden. And a very few, told a different story altogether. They spoke of hearing things from inside the mountain. Years after the war ended, the faint sound of metal grinding on metal, the echo of something moving in the dark. But those were just stories, weren't they? The imaginings of a traumatized population trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to believe that somewhere, buried in the earth, lay evidence of what they'd survived, proof that the nightmare had been real. Or perhaps they'd heard something else, something that was still there, waiting. In the years following the war, as Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes, the legend of the gold train began to spread. It moved like a virus through the collective consciousness, mutating with each retelling, growing more elaborate, more fantastic, more desperate. Treasure hunters arrived in Wałbrzych by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Men with metal detectors and hand-drawn maps, claiming they'd found proof, claiming they knew exactly where the train was buried. The Polish government, now under Soviet control, officially denied the train's existence. But that only made people believe more. Of course they'd deny it. Of course they'd want to keep the gold for themselves. The forest around the Owl Mountains became a graveyard of failed excavations. Holes dug in the dead of night, abandoned when the diggers found nothing but rock and earth. Some treasure hunters disappeared entirely, their fate unknown. Others emerged from the mountains weeks later, half-starved and delirious, speaking of tunnels that led nowhere and sounds that followed them in the darkness. Local residents began to report strange phenomena. Sections of forest where compasses spun uselessly. Areas where electronic devices failed. One farmer claimed his dog refused to enter a particular clearing, would sit at the edge and whine, hackles raised, staring at something invisible among the trees. In 1959, a man named Karl Heinrich arrived in Wałbrzych. He was German, in his 60s, and he told anyone who would listen that he had been there in April 1945. He had been part of the convoy that guarded the train. He knew exactly where it was buried. For the right price, he'd show them. The Polish authorities arrested him for trespassing and attempting illegal excavation. During his interrogation, Heinrich told a story that would haunt investigators for decades. He claimed the train carried more than gold. He claimed it carried something the Nazis had wanted, hidden more than treasure, more than art, something they'd discovered during their occupation of Poland, something old, something that shouldn't have been moved. When pressed for details, Heinrich became agitated. He demanded to speak to a priest. He was denied. 3 days later, Karl Heinrich was found dead in his cell. Official cause: heart failure. Unofficial whispers: he'd scratched words into the cell wall before he died. Words in Latin that no one would translate. The incident was buried in classified files. Heinrich's maps, if they ever existed, disappeared. And the legend grew darker. Because that's what happens when you try to suppress a story. It doesn't die. It transforms. It becomes something more than fact, more than fiction. It becomes a mirror reflecting our deepest fears and desires. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the gold train became an obsession for a certain type of person. Not just treasure hunters, but conspiracy theorists, occultists, amateur historians with theories that ranged from plausible to insane. Some claimed the train was part of a Nazi escape plan meant to fund a Fourth Reich rising from the ashes. Others insisted it was connected to Die Glocke, the supposed Nazi time machine. The wildest theories spoke of ancient artifacts, relics from civilizations that predated human memory, now lying in darkness beneath the Polish mountains. The Polish government, perhaps recognizing they couldn't stop the obsession, began to conduct official surveys of the tunnel networks. Using early ground-penetrating radar and seismic equipment, they mapped the subterranean passages, looking for any sign of the alleged train. They found chambers, yes, collapsed tunnels, absolutely. But no train, no evidence of anything resembling the legend. Their conclusion: if the train ever existed, it had been emptied before the tunnels were sealed. The gold, if there was gold, had been moved long ago. But the true believers didn't accept this. They couldn't, because to accept it would be to admit that the legend was hollow, that the thing they'd devoted years of their lives to pursuing was nothing but smoke and shadow. And perhaps, deep down, they didn't want to find it anyway. Perhaps the search itself was the point, the possibility, the dream of uncovering something that would change everything, that would rewrite history, that would prove the world was more mysterious and magical than the dull reality of post-war bureaucracy and concrete apartment blocks. In the tunnels, though, strange things continued to happen. Exploration teams reported equipment malfunctions, cameras that stopped working for no reason, audio recordings that captured sounds that shouldn't have been there, whispers in German, the distant sound of a train whistle, footsteps that seemed to follow the explorers through the darkness. One team in 1983 went deep into a section of the tunnel network that had been partially collapsed. They were gone for 6 hours, longer than planned. When they emerged, they were changed. Quiet, reluctant to speak about what they'd seen. The lead explorer, a man named Wojciech Kasperzak, would only say, "There are things in those mountains that aren't meant to be disturbed." 2 months later, Kasperzak committed suicide. His note, released by his family years after his death, contained a single line: "The train remembers." What did that mean? No one could say, but it added another layer to the legend, another whisper in the darkness. The gold train wasn't just lost treasure. It was cursed. It was guarded. It was waiting for the right person to find it, or perhaps the wrong person. And so the years passed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Poland emerged as an independent nation. And still, in the mountains near Wałbrzych, the legend persisted. Locals would tell tourists about the gold train over drinks in dimly lit pubs, their voices dropping to a whisper when they reached the darkest parts of the tale. "My grandfather saw it," they'd say. "He was just a boy, but he remembers the sound of the explosions, the way the mountain shook. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, you can hear it down there. The train, still running, still trying to escape. But escape from what? From discovery? From history? Or from something else entirely, something that followed it into the darkness and has been waiting ever since." August 2015. The legend, dormant for years, suddenly exploded back into the global consciousness with a force that shocked even those who'd never heard of the gold train before. 2 treasure hunters, one Polish and one German, submitted a formal claim to the Polish government. They announced, through their lawyer, that they had located the train using modern ground-penetrating radar. They knew exactly where it was. They had proof, and they wanted 10% of whatever treasure it contained in exchange for revealing its location. The world went insane. Within hours, international media descended on Wałbrzych. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, every major news organization sent correspondents to this quiet Polish town that most people couldn't find on a map. The story had everything: Nazis, gold, mystery, and the tantalizing possibility that one of World War II's greatest legends might actually be true. The Polish government, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. They were cautious, diplomatic. Yes, they'd received the claim. No, they couldn't confirm anything yet. They would investigate. But their very caution only fueled the speculation. If there was nothing there, why not just say so? Why the careful, measured responses? The two treasure hunters, identified as Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, gave interviews from undisclosed locations, their voices disguised, their faces hidden. They described spending years researching Nazi documents, interviewing elderly witnesses, piecing together clues from fragmented records. They'd used ground-penetrating radar in a specific section of railway line near Vaubzig, and the results were unmistakable. There was something down there, something large, something metal, something with the approximate dimensions of a World War II-era train. The images they released showed ghostly underground shapes, blurry but suggestive. To the believers, it was proof. To the skeptics, it was wishful thinking, radar anomalies that could be explained by any number of geological features or buried debris. But the court of public opinion had already decided. The gold train was real. It had been found. And now the only question was what treasures it contained. The speculation became fever pitch. Historians estimated the potential value of the cargo at hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly billions. Not just gold bars, but art masterpieces lost since the war. Paintings by Rembrandt, sculptures by Michelangelo, jewels from royal collections across Europe. The train became a symbol of everything the Nazis had stolen, everything that had never been recovered, everything that still waited to be reclaimed. But there were darker rumors, too. Whispers that circulated on conspiracy forums and late-night radio shows. Some claimed the train contained Nazi documents, evidence of war crimes that powerful people still wanted hidden. Others spoke of experimental weapons, prototypes of technology decades ahead of its time. And a very few, repeated the old stories about artifacts, about things the Nazis had uncovered during their archaeological expeditions to Tibet and the Middle East, objects of power that shouldn't exist in the rational world. The Polish government, facing mounting pressure, assembled a team: military personnel, historians, engineers, and railway experts. They would investigate the site, conduct their own radar surveys, and determine once and for all if there was anything buried beneath that stretch of railway line. The operation was scheduled for November 2015. The world watched and waited. In Vaubzig, the town transformed. Hotels filled with journalists and treasure hunters. Entrepreneurs sold gold train merchandise, T-shirts, maps, toy trains. The local economy, depressed for years, suddenly boomed. Gift shops appeared overnight. Tour guides offered to take people to the supposed location of the train, even though access was restricted. Someone opened a themed restaurant called the Golden Locomotive. But beneath the carnival atmosphere, something else stirred. The older residents, those who remembered the war and the years of failed treasure hunts, weren't celebrating. They looked worried. One elderly woman interviewed by a local journalist said something that sent chills through those who understood. "My mother told me never to look for that train. She said some doors are meant to stay closed." When asked why, the woman wouldn't elaborate. She just shook her head and walked away. November arrived with unseasonable cold. The investigation team set up their equipment at the designated site, a stretch of embankment near a curve in the railway line where the radar images suggested something was buried about 10 meters below the surface. They worked behind security barriers, their progress monitored by dozens of cameras from news organizations around the world. The initial surveys were promising. Something was definitely down there. Multiple large metallic objects, arranged in a way consistent with railway cars. The excitement was palpable. After 70 years, the legend was about to be proven true. But then, complications arose. The ground-penetrating radar revealed that the buried objects were located in an area laced with potential unexploded ordnance. The tunnel system, it seemed, had been booby-trapped before being sealed. Approaching it would be extraordinarily dangerous. Excavation would have to proceed slowly, carefully, with bomb disposal experts on standby. Weeks passed, then months. The media, restless for results, began to drift away. Some journalists left, then more. The initial excitement cooled into impatient waiting, and in that waiting, doubts began to creep in. Additional surveys were conducted, more sophisticated equipment was brought in, and slowly, gradually, the images began to tell a different story. What the radar had initially shown as train cars might actually be geological features, natural rock formations that mimicked the shape of manufactured objects. The metallic signatures could be explained by ore deposits in the surrounding stone. By January 2016, the official conclusion was unavoidable. There was no train. The radar anomalies were natural features given significance only by the desperate desire to find something that wasn't there. The two treasure hunters disputed the findings. They insisted the government hadn't searched in the right location, that their evidence was solid. But without concrete proof, their claims faded into the background noise of conspiracy theories and disappointed dreams. The world moved on. The media found other stories. Wałbrzych returned to its quiet existence, the gold train tourists disappearing as quickly as they'd arrived. The themed restaurant closed. The gift shops returned to selling traditional Polish souvenirs. And in the mountains, the tunnels remained sealed, silent, untouched. But here's the thing about legends. They don't die just because evidence disproves them. They adapt, they evolve, they find new forms. Because almost immediately, alternative theories began to circulate. Maybe the government found the train but covered it up. Maybe the treasure was too valuable, too politically sensitive to acknowledge. Maybe there were things in those tunnel cars that powerful people didn't want revealed. Maybe. And some people, the true believers, pointed to something else, something the official reports had mentioned but glossed over. During the investigation, several team members reported hearing sounds from beneath the earth, sounds that didn't match any known geological activity, sounds that one engineer, speaking anonymously, described as mechanical, rhythmic, like something breathing. The official explanation: ground settling, water flowing through underground chambers, perfectly normal acoustic phenomena amplified by the tunnel structure. But at night, when the investigation team had packed up and left the site, locals reported seeing lights in the forest. Faint blue-green glows that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Security cameras, reviewing footage later, captured shadows moving across the embankment when no one should have been there. Shadows that seemed too long, too angular, too wrong to be human. All explainable, of course, camera artifacts, tricks of moonlight, the mind playing games in the darkness. But the people of Wałbrzych knew better. They'd lived with this legend their entire lives. They'd seen what it did to people, how it consumed them, changed them. And they knew that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some secrets are buried for a reason. As one local priest told a departing journalist, "You come here looking for gold." But gold isn't what's buried in these mountains. It's guilt, it's grief. It's the weight of history that we've tried to bury but can never escape. And maybe that's heavier than any treasure could ever be. Let's talk about the people who've dedicated their lives to finding the gold train. Because this isn't just a story about lost treasure, it's a story about obsession and what happens when obsession becomes indistinguishable from madness. Over the decades, dozens of treasure hunters have descended on the Owl Mountains, each convinced they possess the key to solving the mystery. Most leave empty-handed, their savings depleted, their relationships destroyed by years of chasing a ghost. But some don't leave at all. In 1987, a German businessman named Ernst Müller sold everything he owned and moved to Wałbrzych. He'd spent 3 years researching the gold train in archives across Europe, and he was certain he'd found evidence that proved the train's location. He began excavating in a section of forest near the sealed tunnels, working alone, refusing all offers of help. 6 months into his dig, Müller stopped coming into town for supplies. Concerned neighbors eventually checked on him. They found his campsite abandoned, his excavation equipment scattered, as if he'd left in a hurry. But there was no sign of Müller himself. No note, no explanation. His disappearance was investigated by local police, but without evidence of foul play, the case went cold. Müller's family back in Germany hired private investigators. They found nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the earth. But here's what they didn't report publicly. In Miller's abandoned tent, investigators found his journal. The final entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating from neat script into frenzied scrawls. He wrote about hearing voices from inside the mountain, voices speaking in German, calling his name. He described dreams where he walked through endless tunnels filled with gold that turned to ash when he touched it. And in his last entry, written the day before he disappeared, he wrote, "I've found the entrance. It's been waiting for me. I can hear the train. It's still running. I'm going inside." The journal was classified by authorities and kept from the public for years. When it was finally released through a Freedom of Information request in 2003, skeptics dismissed it as the ravings of a man suffering from isolation and delusion. But those who believed in the gold train saw it differently. They saw it as proof that Miller had found something, and whatever he found had claimed him. He wasn't the only one. In 1995, a Polish engineer named Tomasz Kowalski obtained permits to conduct a legitimate geological survey of the tunnel network. He entered one of the accessible sections with a team of students from the local university. They were supposed to be underground for 4 hours. They emerged after 9, filthy and traumatized, refusing to explain what had delayed them. 2 of the students dropped out of the university immediately and left Poland. The others never spoke about the expedition. Kowalski himself became withdrawn, paranoid. He moved away from Wałbrzych within a year. When a journalist tracked him down in 2007 and asked about the expedition, Kowalski's response was chilling. "We didn't find a train. We found something worse, and if you're smart, you'll never go looking for it." What did he mean? What could be worse than an empty tunnel or a failed treasure hunt? Kowalski died in 2012 without elaborating, taking his secret to the grave. Then there's the story of the Wojcik brothers, amateur treasure hunters who became local legends in their own right. For 15 years, from 1992 to 2007, they spent every weekend exploring the mountains, mapping old German railway lines, interviewing elderly witnesses who might remember something about the war years. They were methodical, scientific, avoiding the wild speculation that plagued other treasure hunters. In 2007, they told their family they'd found something significant. They were going to do one final expedition, one last survey, and if this didn't pan out, they'd give up the search forever. They entered the mountains on a Friday morning in October. By Sunday evening, when they hadn't returned, their family notified authorities. The search and rescue team found them 3 days later, alive but in a state of profound psychological shock. They were huddled in a small chamber about a kilometer from any known tunnel entrance, as if they'd been trying to hide from something. Both men were hospitalized for severe dehydration and hypothermia, despite carrying adequate supplies. When they recovered enough to speak, their stories didn't match. The elder brother, Andrei, claimed they'd gotten lost when their equipment failed. The younger, Piotr, said they'd found a hidden passage and followed it into sections of the tunnel network that weren't on any maps. He described chambers carved with strange symbols, air that felt thick and heavy, and the sensation of being watched by something they couldn't see. Most disturbing was what the rescue team found in that chamber where the brothers had been hiding. Scratched into the rock wall, in fresh marks made with a rocker tool, was a message. ITKNOWSWEREHERE. The brothers never went treasure hunting again. They never spoke publicly about what happened. And when pressed by family members, they would only say that some things in those mountains should never be found. Are these stories true? Are they exaggerations born from fear and exhaustion? Or are they evidence of something genuinely strange lurking beneath the Owl Mountains? The rational explanation is clear. The tunnels are dangerous. They're unstable, poorly ventilated, and riddled with potential hazards. People who enter them are taking enormous risks. Disorientation, panic, accidents, these are the real dangers, not curses or supernatural forces. But rationality doesn't explain the patterns. It doesn't explain why so many people, independently, report similar experiences. the voices, the sounds of machinery that shouldn't be running, the sense of presence, of being observed, the dreams that plague treasure hunters for years after they've given up the search. There's a local legend, rarely spoken about outside the region, that the gold train is protected, not by the German soldiers who sealed the tunnels, but by something older. The Owl Mountains, according to folklore, were considered sacred by the Slavic people who lived there before recorded history. Certain caves were forbidden, places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin. When the Nazis carved their tunnels into those mountains, some locals say they disturbed something, awakened something, and when they sealed the train inside, they didn't just hide treasure, they trapped it with whatever dwells in those sacred spaces, creating a fusion of human greed and ancient power. It sounds absurd in the daylight, in the modern world of satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar. But in the darkness of those tunnels, where the air smells of earth and decay and something else, something indefinable, in those places, the rational mind begins to question itself. And perhaps that's the real curse of the gold train. Not that it's protected by supernatural forces, but that the search for it reveals something dark about human nature. The willingness to risk everything, to sacrifice relationships and sanity and sometimes life itself for the possibility of wealth that may not exist. The gold train is a mirror, and what it reflects isn't pretty. Let's step back from the tunnels, from the treasure hunters and their tragic ends, and ask a more fundamental question. Why do we care about the Nazi gold train? Why has this legend persisted for 80 years when countless other wartime mysteries have faded into obscurity? The answer, I think, tells us something profound about how we process history, guilt, and the human capacity for evil. The Nazi regime represents, for most of the modern world, the absolute nadir of human civilization. The Holocaust, the genocide, the industrial-scale murder of innocents. It stands as a warning of what humans are capable of when ideology and hatred merge with bureaucratic efficiency. We study it, we memorialize it, we say, never again. But underneath that moral clarity lies something uncomfortable. The Nazis didn't just murder, they profited, they stole, they accumulated vast wealth through systematic plunder, and that wealth had to go somewhere. Some of it was recovered, some of it was returned, but some of it disappeared. And the idea that Nazi gold might still be out there, hidden, waiting, is deeply disturbing because it suggests that the crimes of the Reich are unfinished, that there are still accounts to settle, treasures to return, justice to pursue. As long as the gold train remains unfound, history itself feels incomplete. But it's more than that. The legend of the gold train also taps into something primal, the fantasy of discovering lost treasure. It's the same impulse that drives people to buy lottery tickets, to dream of finding a forgotten Picasso in their grandmother's attic, to believe that somewhere, somehow, fortune is waiting to smile upon them. The gold train represents the ultimate treasure hunt, not pirates' doubloons or Incan gold, but treasure stolen from real people, treasure with moral weight, treasure that comes with a story of suffering and survival. Finding it wouldn't just make someone rich. It would make them historically significant. It would give them a role in the ongoing narrative of World War II, a chance to be part of something larger than themselves. And perhaps that's what the treasure hunters are really seeking, not gold, but meaning, purpose, a quest that elevates their ordinary lives into something epic, something that will be remembered. Because in our modern world, where everything feels documented and mapped and understood, true mystery is rare. The gold train offers a glimpse of something unknown, something that resists our satellite imagery and our databases, something that belongs to an earlier, darker era. But there's a shadow side to this romance. The obsession with Nazi treasure can become a way of avoiding the harder truths of the Holocaust. It's easier to think about hidden gold than to think about the families that gold was stolen from. It's easier to imagine tunnels and trains than to contemplate the camps where millions died. The treasure hunt becomes, in a sense, a distraction from the moral reckoning that we're still struggling to complete. Some survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants have spoken about this with great pain. They point out that the fascination with Nazi gold often ignores the human cost of its accumulation. Every bar of gold, every piece of jewelry, every painting in that alleged train, all of it was stolen. All of it represents lives destroyed, families torn apart, a civilization systematically murdered. When treasure hunters search for the gold train, are they honoring that history or exploiting it? Are they seeking justice or adventure? The answer isn't clear, and that ambiguity haunts the entire legend. There's also the question of what should happen if the train is ever found. Who does the treasure belong to? The Polish government, on whose territory it would be discovered? The countries from which the art and gold were originally stolen? The heirs of the individuals and families who were murdered for their possessions? The legal and moral questions are staggering, and perhaps, on some level, the fact that the train remains lost is a kind of mercy. Because finding it would force us to confront these questions, to make decisions about ownership and restitution that have no good answers. As long as it stays buried, we can avoid that reckoning. We can maintain the fantasy without facing the reality. But let's return to the legend itself, because there's one more layer we need to examine. The legend doesn't just persist because of greed or historical fascination. It persists because it's a good story. A great story. It has all the elements: mystery, danger, hidden treasure, evil villains, brave searchers. It's a narrative that appeals to something deep in the human psyche, the same part of us that responds to myths and fairy tales. And like all great legends, it evolves. Each generation adds new details, new interpretations. In the 1950s, it was about defeating the last remnants of Nazism by finding their stolen wealth. In the 1980s, it became entangled with New Age mysticism and conspiracy theories. In the 2010s, it merged with reality TV culture and viral media. The core story stays the same, but it shapeshifts to reflect contemporary anxieties and desires. What will the legend become in the decades to come? Will future generations still search for the gold train, or will it fade finally into history, a curiosity from a darker age? Will technology eventually map every cubic meter of the Owl Mountains, removing all mystery, or will there always be gaps in our knowledge, spaces where legends can hide? I don't have the answer, but I know this. As long as there are tunnels we haven't fully explored, as long as there are documents we haven't fully decoded, as long as there's a chance, however small, that the gold train might be real, people will keep searching. Because we're haunted by the past, by the crimes that were never fully punished, the treasures that were never returned, the questions that were never answered. The gold train is all of those things compressed into a single, powerful symbol. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe the legend doesn't need to be true. Maybe its power comes from the searching itself, from the reminder that history isn't neat or complete, that there are still mysteries buried in the earth, still accounts unsettled, still stories waiting to be told. The gold train is a wound that never healed, a question that can't be answered, a ghost that haunts not just the mountains of Poland, but the collective conscience of a civilization that's still trying to understand how it could have fallen so far. It's late evening in Wałbrzych. The sun has set behind the Owl Mountains, casting long shadows across the town. In the pubs and restaurants, locals serve dinner to tourists who've come hoping to glimpse something of the legend. The gold train merchandise is still for sale, though less than it was in 2015. The fever has passed, but the dream remains. In the mountains, the tunnels are silent. Some have been opened for tourism, lit with electric lights, made safe for visitors who want to see where history happened. But others remain sealed, forgotten, dangerous. And in those sealed sections, in the darkness that hasn't seen light in 80 years, something might still be waiting. I want to tell you that we've solved the mystery, that I can give you a definitive answer about whether the gold train exists or not. But that would be a lie, because the truth is, we don't know. We may never know. The evidence suggests the train is a myth, a post-war legend born from chaos and desperate hope. But evidence isn't the same as certainty. There are too many unexplained reports, too many strange occurrences, too many people who have claimed to find it, only to be silenced or discredited or driven mad. And there's this. In 2019, 4 years after the media frenzy died down, a construction crew working on a new highway outside Wałbrzych broke through into an unknown tunnel section. The workers reported that when they first opened the hole, they heard something echo from deep inside, something that one worker described as the sound of wheels on rails, but distant, like it was coming from miles away. The tunnel was surveyed, found to be structurally unsound, and sealed again within a week. Official reports say they found nothing unusual. But the workers who were there, who stood at that opening and heard that sound, they tell a different story in private. They say the air that came from that tunnel smelled wrong, not just stale or dusty, but metallic, like blood and rust mixed together. They say the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant when the hole was opened. And they say that in the darkness beyond, just for a moment, they saw lights. Green lights, like lanterns, or eyes receding into the depths of the mountain. Are they telling the truth? Were they spooked by the creepy atmosphere and the legend they'd grown up with? Or did they glimpse something that's been waiting there since 1945, something that watches the sealed entrances and listens for footsteps that never come? We want answers. We want closure. We want to know that the world is rational and explicable and safe. But some stories resist that impulse. Some mysteries refuse to be solved. The Nazi gold train might be one of them, and perhaps that's fitting. Because the crimes of the Nazi regime, the scope and scale of the Holocaust, the way an entire civilization descended into barbarism, those things don't have neat explanations either. They resist our attempts to fully comprehend them. They remain, in some fundamental way, beyond our ability to process. So the gold train stays buried, in the earth or in the imagination, or in some space between reality and myth where legends live. It carries not just gold, but the weight of all that stolen history, all those murdered lives, all that unfinished business. And every year, a few more people venture into the mountains. They carry their metal detectors and their dreams. They dig their holes and they explore their tunnels. Some find nothing. Some find evidence that convinces them they're close. And some don't come back quite the same as they went in. The locals watch them come and go. They shake their heads. They could warn them, tell them about the pattern, about what happens to people who get too close to the legend. But they've learned that some people need to touch the fire themselves. Some people need to descend into the darkness before they understand why others fear it. And so the cycle continues, the legend grows, the searches go on. And somewhere in the Owl Mountains, in tunnels that may or may not exist, something waits, or doesn't wait, or exists in that uncertain state where observation changes reality, where belief creates truth. I started this story by asking what you would do to find the gold train. Now, at the end, I want to ask a different question. What would you do if you actually found it? Imagine yourself standing at the entrance of a tunnel. You've spent years searching, sacrificed relationships and resources, driven by the certainty that you're right, that everyone else was wrong. And now, finally, your equipment is showing something. The ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie. There's something down there, something large and metallic and train-shaped. You have the explosives to breach the sealed entrance. You have the lights and the equipment to explore what's inside. You're standing at the threshold of discovery, at the moment when legend becomes reality, when your life transforms from ordinary to extraordinary. Do you go inside, or do you walk away? Because here's what history teaches us. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some secrets, once revealed, change everything. The gold train, if it exists, is more than treasure. It's a time capsule from humanity's darkest hour. It's evidence of crimes that we've tried to move past. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when we abandon our moral compass. Finding it wouldn't just make headlines, it would reopen wounds. It would raise questions about who knew what and when. It would force legal battles that could last decades. It would prove that the past isn't past, that history reaches forward with skeletal fingers to grab us when we least expect it. Maybe that's why the train has stayed lost for so long. Not because it doesn't exist, but because on some level we don't want to find it. We'd rather have the legend, the mystery, the possibility, because possibility is safe, reality is dangerous. The treasure hunters who disappeared, the ones who went mad, the ones who came back changed. Maybe they understood this. Maybe they found something that forced them to confront not just history, but themselves. The part of them that was drawn to Nazi gold, that was excited by the prospect of wealth stolen from the dead. Maybe what they found in those tunnels was a mirror, and they couldn't bear what it reflected. Or maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe it's simpler. Maybe there's just a train buried in a tunnel, slowly rusting into nothing as the decades pass. No curse, no mystery, just metal and time and the inevitable decay of all things. But I don't think that's the story we want to hear. We want the mystery. We need the mystery. Because a world without unanswered questions is a world fully mapped and cataloged and understood. A world with no room for wonder, no space for the unknown. The gold train gives us that space. It's a crack in the foundation of certainty, a place where our neat explanations break down and we're forced to admit that maybe, just maybe, we don't know everything. That there are still dark places in the world, still secrets buried so deep that they may never be uncovered. And that's terrifying. But it's also, in a strange way, comforting. Because it means the world is bigger than we think, more mysterious, more alive with possibility. So here we stand, 80 years after a train allegedly vanished into a mountain. The evidence says it's a myth. The believers say it's real. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, in a dimension where facts and legends intertwine so tightly that they become indistinguishable. The tunnels remain. The mountains keep their secrets. And somewhere in Poland, someone is planning their next expedition, convinced that they'll be the one to finally solve the mystery that has eluded everyone else. Maybe they will. Maybe tomorrow, or next year, or 100 years from now, someone will break through that final barrier and find what lies beyond. They'll shine their light into the darkness and see it. The train, exactly as the legend describes, loaded with gold and art and secrets. Or maybe they'll find nothing but rocks and earth and the echo of their own footsteps in empty chambers. Or maybe, and this is what keeps me awake at night, maybe they'll find something else entirely. Something we haven't imagined. Something that's been waiting in the darkness all this time, patient and hungry and aware. Because that's the thing about legends. They take on a life of their own. They become real not because they're true, but because we believe in them so deeply that they shape our actions, our choices, our very perception of reality. The gold train is real because we've made it real. We've fed it with our dreams and fears and obsessions until it's become something more than history, more than treasure. It's become part of us. And we've become part of it. The tunnels remember, the mountains remember, and somewhere in the darkness, something is still running, still moving, still waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to find it. Are you that person? Do you dare to search? Or will you do what the wise ones do, what the survivors recommend, what the locals have learned through bitter experience? Will you leave the gold train where it lies, in the shadows where it belongs, in the darkness that has claimed it? Because some treasures aren't meant to be found, some doors aren't meant to be opened, some legends are warnings, not invitations. The choice, as always, is yours. But choose carefully, because the mountains are watching, the tunnels are listening, and the gold train, wherever it is, whatever it is, it's waiting. It's always been waiting, and it will wait forever, or until the right person, or the wrong person, finally finds it. Sleep well, and if you dream of tunnels tonight, of distant lights in the darkness, of the sound of wheels on rails echoing through the earth, remember, it's just a dream, just a legend, just a story we tell ourselves about a train that vanished without a trace. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing else.